So, what was this thing called Hippocrates? The simplest answer is that it was a spiced wine. But that's like saying a castle is just a big house. It doesn't really tell you the whole story. Hippocrates was a huge deal in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. It was a drink for the rich, a medicine for the sick, and a symbol of power. Imagine a world without refrigeration. Food went bad quickly. Water was often unsafe to drink. And wine was a daily staple for many, but it wasn't always great quality. It could be sour, young, or on the verge of turning. One way to make this less than perfect wine taste better was to add things to it. And the most valuable things you could add were spices and sugar. This is where Hippocrates comes in. It was wine, usually red but sometimes white, that was heavily sweetened and infused with a powerful mix of aromatic spices. Think cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, and others. The result was a potent, sweet, and fragrant drink that was unlike anything else. It wasn't just about masking bad flavors, it was about creating a new luxurious flavor. The name itself gives you a clue about its status. It was named after Hippocrates, the ancient Greek physician often called the father of medicine. The connection isn't direct, as in he didn't invent the drink, but in the Middle Ages his name was a byword for health and medical wisdom. People believed that spices had medicinal properties. They thought spices could help with digestion, warm the body, and balance its internal systems. So calling the spiced wine Hippocrates was like calling a modern health drink doctor's formula. It gave the drink an air of medical authority. It was also associated with a specific filtering method. The spices were not just boiled in the wine, they were ground up and steeped in the wine, and then the liquid was poured through a special cloth filter, a sort of conical bag. This filter was called a manicum hippocraticum, or a sleeve of Hippocrates. The process of filtering the wine through this sleeve gave the drink its name and its famous clarity. A good Hippocrates was not cloudy with spice dust. It was clear and jewel-toned. You didn't drink Hippocrates like you would drink ale or regular table wine. It was too expensive and too potent for that. It was typically served at the end of a grand feast. After course of heavy food, a small cup of Hippocrates was served alongside little cakes or wafers. This was seen as a digestif. It was believed to help the stomach process the rich meal that had just been eaten. This end-of-meal ritual was a formal way to signal that the banquet was over. But more than anything, Hippocrates was a status symbol. The main ingredients, Sean, sugar, and exotic spices, were incredibly expensive. They had to be imported from thousands of miles away, from Asia and Africa, through a long and dangerous trade network. Only the wealthiest nobles, merchants, and clergy could afford them in large quantities. So, to serve Hypocras to your guests was a clear and powerful statement. It said, "I am so wealthy that I can afford to turn my wine into a liquid version of a spice box." It was a form of conspicuous consumption, a way to show off your place in the world. So, Hippocrates was many things at once. It was a way to make wine taste better. It was a respected form of medicine. It was a formal part of a social ritual, and it was one of the ultimate luxury goods of its time. It was a drink that captured the medieval fascination with exotic flavors, ancient wisdom, and the public display of wealth. The character of Hypocras came entirely from its ingredients, and those ingredients tell a story about medieval trade, status, and science. You couldn't just whip up a batch of things from your local garden. Making real Hypocras required sourcing some of the most expensive and sought-after materials in the world at that time. First, you needed wine. This was the base. Both red and white wine were used, and recipes often specified one or the other. The quality of the wine itself wasn't always the top priority. In fact, the strong flavors of the sugar and spices could do a great job of covering up the taste of a wine that was a bit harsh, acidic, or young. This was a practical benefit. A lord could take his ordinary cask wine and transform it into a luxury beverage fit for a king. Of course, starting with the better wine would likely result in a better final product, but it wasn't a strict requirement. The transformation was the point. Next, and just as important, was the sweetener. Today we think of sugar as a cheap, everyday commodity. In the Middle Ages, it was the complete opposite. Cane sugar, which was grown in places like the Middle East and Mediterranean islands, was a rare and costly import in most of Europe. It was often sold in solid cones and was sometimes treated more like a spice than a basic foodstuff. Its price put on par with other luxury goods, for many people, honey was the standard sweetener. And honey was certainly used in some versions of Hippocrates, especially by those who couldn't afford sugar. But the most prestigious recipes called for sugar. Using sugar instead of honey was another way to display wealth. It gave the drink a cleaner, more refined sweetness that was highly prized. But the real soul of Hypocras was the spice blend. This is what made it so special and so incredibly expensive. The collection of spices used was known as powder fort or strong powder. Each spice had to travel an immense distance to reach a European kitchen. The spice trade was a global network that stretched from the Spice Islands in modern-day Indonesia, across India, through the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, overland by camel caravan, and finally into the hands of Venetian and Genoese merchants who controlled its distribution in Europe. At every step of the journey, the price went up. Cinnamon was a key ingredient. It gave Hippocrates its characteristic warm, sweet, and woody aroma. True cinnamon came from Sri Lanka, but a similar, more common bark called cassia from China and Southeast Asia was often used as well. Medieval cooks probably didn't distinguish between them too much, but both were imported luxuries. And ginger was another essential. It provided a pungent, spicy heat that was very different from the burn of pepper. It was valued for its flavor and for its perceived medicinal qualities, especially as a digestive aid. It came from Asia and was traded in its dried, powdered form. Cloves were perhaps the most powerful and one of the most expensive spices of all. They were tiny, dried flower buds from a tree that grew only on a few small islands in the Maluku archipelago of Indonesia. Cloves had an intense, penetrating flavor. A little went a long way. Their rarity made them astronomically expensive. Owning a small quantity of cloves was a sign of serious wealth. And nutmeg and its lacy red covering, mace, were also from the Spice Islands. They offered a warm, slightly sweet, and complex flavor. They were two distinct spices from the same fruit, and both were highly valued. Like cloves, their remote origin made them a top-tier luxury. Then there were other, slightly less common spices. Grains of paradise, a spice from West Africa, had a pungent, peppery flavor. It was sometimes used as a cheaper alternative to true black pepper, which was also a costly import from India. Cardamom, with its floral and camphor-like notes, might be included. Galangal, a root related to ginger with a more piney flavor, was another possibility. Some very old recipes even mention spikenard, an aromatic root from the Himalayas with a heavy, musky scent. The exact blend of these spices varied from recipe to recipe. A cook would have their own preferred mix. They would grind the whole spices together using a mortar and pestle to create their signature powder. The combination of these powerful aromas, the sweetness of cinnamon, the heat of ginger, the intensity of cloves is what defined Hippocrates. When you drank it, you were literally tasting a map of the known world. You were tasting the immense effort and expense it took to bring those flavors to a castle in England or a manor in France. Each sip was a taste of wealth, power, and the exotic, distant lands that most people could only dream of. Making Hippocrates was not a simple process of just dumping spices into a jug of wine. It was a craft. It required patience and a specific piece of equipment that was central to the drink's identity. The goal was to infuse the wine with the full flavor and aroma of the spices while leaving behind all the gritty sediment, resulting in a perfectly clear, beautifully colored liquid. The first step was preparing the spice mixture. The spices cinnamon sticks, whole cloves, dried ginger root, nutmegs were not used whole. They were ground down into a coarse powder. This was done by hand, using a heavy mortar and pestle. Grinding the spices just before using them would have released their essential oils, making the flavor much more vibrant and potent than using pre-ground powders that might have been sitting for months. The cook would create their own specific blend, their powder fort, based on a family recipe or personal preference. Some blends might be heavier on the cinnamon for sweetness, others might have more ginger for a spicy kick. Once the spice powder was ready, it was mixed with a portion of the wine. Recipes vary on the next step. Some suggest simply letting the spices steep in the cold wine for a long period, sometimes up to a day, to let the flavors infuse slowly. This cold infusion method would result in a very fresh, aromatic flavor profile without cooking off any of the alcohol or delicate scents. Other recipes call for gently heating the wine and spice mixture. This wasn't a vigorous boil like we might do for modern mulled wine. That would have been seen as crude. Instead, the wine would be warmed just enough to help the sugar dissolve and to speed up the extraction of flavor from the spices. After the infusion period, whether hot or cold, came the most critical stage clarification. Nobody wanted a gritty, cloudy drink. The mark of a well-made Hippocrates was its clarity. To achieve this, a special tool was used, the manicum hippocraticum, or Hippocratic sleeve. This was not a sleeve from a piece of clothing. It was a conical filter bag, usually made of cotton or wool felt, stitched to a point at the bottom. It looked a lot like a modern-day jelly bag or a large barista's filter. The infused wine, full of spice particles, was poured into this bag, which was suspended over a large bowl or pot. The wine would then slowly drip through the dense fabric. The first pass would catch the majority of the spice powder, but the liquid might still be a bit hazy. So, the process was repeated. The filtered wine was poured back into the sleeve for a second pass, and then maybe a third, or even a fourth. Each time the wine passed through the filter, more of the fine sediment was trapped, and the liquid became clearer and more polished. Some recipes even suggest using the spent spices from the first pass to flavor a second, inferior batch of wine, ensuring nothing was wasted. This slow, repetitive filtering was the key to the final product. It was a time-consuming and careful job. It not only clarified the wine, but was also believed to meld the flavors together, creating a smoother, more harmonious drink. The name of this tool, linking it to the great physician Hippocrates, reinforced the drink's medicinal reputation. It suggested a scientific, almost alchemical process of purification. Finally, once the Hypocras was deemed perfectly clear, it was ready. It could be bottled and stored. Since it was high in both sugar and alcohol, it would have kept reasonably well. Unlike modern mulled wine, which is almost always served hot, Hippocras was most often served at room temperature or even chilled. Serving it hot was an option, especially for medicinal purposes to warm a sick person, but its primary role as a sophisticated banquet drink meant it was usually served cool. So the creation of Hypocras was a deliberate art. It started with the careful selection and grinding of impossibly expensive spices. It continued with a gentle infusion to draw out their essence, and it culminated in a painstaking process of filtration that transformed a cloudy mixture into a brilliant, jewel-like liquid. It was this care and attention to detail that elevated it from simple spiced wine to a true medieval luxury. People in the Middle Ages didn't drink Hippocras just because it tasted good. It served two very important functions in their society. It was considered a powerful form of medicine, and it was an undeniable symbol of wealth and social standing. These two roles were deeply intertwined. The medical aspect of Hippocras was rooted in the prevailing scientific theory of the day, the doctrine of the four humors. This theory, inherited from the ancient Greeks like Hippocrates and Galen, held that the human body was composed of four basic fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A person's health and temperament were determined by the balance of these humors. Each humor was associated with a quality: hot, cold, moist, or dry. Sickness was thought to be the result of an imbalance. Food and drink were also classified according to these qualities. The goal of a healthy diet was to eat things that maintained your personal humoral balance. Spices like cinnamon, ginger, and cloves were classified as hot and dry. A big, heavy meal, especially one with a lot of meat and fish, was considered to be cold and moist in its effect on the stomach. Therefore, drinking a hot and dry beverage like Hypocras at the end of the meal was seen as a perfectly logical way to counteract the cold food. It was believed to warm the stomach, stoke the digestive fires, and help the body process the feast efficiently. It wasn't just a pleasant after-dinner drink, it was a practical prescription for avoiding indigestion and maintaining good health. This is why it was almost always served at the very end of a banquet as a digestif. It was the medieval equivalent of taking an antacid, but infinitely more glamorous. This medical respectability blended seamlessly with its role as a status symbol. The very things that made Hippocras healthy, the exotic spices, were also what made it astronomically expensive. For a host, to serve Hypocras was a public declaration of immense wealth. It was a way of showing off that was both subtle and impossible to miss. Think about the context of a medieval feast. It was theater. The Lord sat at a high table, looking down on his guests. The dishes were brought out in grand processions. The food itself was a display: peacocks redressed in their feathers, elaborate sugar sculptures called subtleties, pies filled with live birds. Everything was meant to impress, to demonstrate power and generosity. Hippocras was the grand finale of this performance. When the main courses were cleared away, a special ceremony called the voidie, or the issue to table, would take place. Servants would bring out trays with small, delicate spice cakes, wafers, or candied fruits, and, most importantly, small cups of Hypocras. This was the final, luxurious touch. It signaled that the formal part of the meal was ending, and guests could soon depart. By offering this drink, the host was not only providing a digestive aid, but also sharing his most precious commodities. He was essentially serving liquid gold. The guests would understand the message perfectly. The cost of the spices in their small cup might be more than a common laborer earned in a week or even a month. Hippocrates was present at the most important events in a noble's life. It was served at coronation feasts, royal weddings, and major diplomatic gatherings. King Richard II of England was known to be a great fan. His court recipe book, The Form of Cury, contains instructions for making it. In chronicles from the period frequently mention Hippocrates being served at critical state functions. Its presence elevated the occasion, lending it an air of gravity and splendor. So, for the medieval elite, health and wealth were not separate concepts. To be able to afford the finest, most exotic ingredients was to be able to afford the best health. The sweet, spicy warmth of Hypocras in your stomach was both a physical comfort and a psychological one. It was the feeling of good digestion and the feeling of belonging to the highest ranks of society, all in a single sip. The drink was a perfect reflection of a worldview where medicine, luxury, and social order were all connected. Like all things, the reign of Hippocrates eventually came to an end. For several centuries, it was the pinnacle of sophisticated drinking, but by the 17th and 18th centuries, it had started to fade from the tables of the wealthy. Its decline was not due to a single event, but a slow shift in taste, science, and economics. One of the biggest factors was the change in medical understanding. The theory of the four humors, which had been the foundation of Western medicine for over 1,000 years, began to be replaced by new scientific ideas based on anatomy, chemistry, and observation. As doctors moved away from the idea of balancing hot and cold humors, the medicinal justification for drinking Hippocrates weakened. Augustine is a necessary digestive aid, prescribed by ancient wisdom. It started to seem like an old-fashioned folk remedy. At the same time, the world of luxury drinks was expanding. New and exciting beverages were arriving in Europe from across the globe. Coffee from the Ottoman Empire, tea from China, and chocolate from the Americas became the new fashionable drinks. As coffee houses and tea rooms sprang up in cities, offering new social rituals. For the wealthy, these bitter, stimulating new drinks were a mark of modern cosmopolitan taste. The heavy, sweet, and spicy profile of Hippocrates began to seem cloying and old-fashioned in comparison. Furthermore, the wine world itself was changing. The development of new techniques in winemaking and storage led to the rise of fortified wines like port, sherry, and Madeira. These drinks offered complex flavors and higher alcohol content, and they kept well for long journeys. They became the new preferred after-dinner drinks, supplanting the role that Hippocrates had once held. A glass of port became the new signal that a fine meal was ending. Finally, the very thing that had made Hippocrates so special, the rarity of its ingredients, began to change. As global trade routes expanded and became more established, particularly with the Portuguese and Dutch breaking the old Venetian monopoly, the price of spices began to fall. They were still expensive, but they were no longer the almost mythical luxury goods they had once been. Sugar also became more widely available and cheaper with the expansion of plantations in the New World. When the middle classes could start to afford cinnamon and cloves, the elite lost interest. A status symbol, by its nature, has to be exclusive. Once it's no longer exclusive, the wealthy move on to the next new thing. So Hippocrates gradually fell out of favor. The recipes lingered in old cookbooks, and some people might have continued to make it at home, but its time as the king of drinks was over. It became a historical curiosity, but it never completely disappeared. Its spirit lived on in other forms. The tradition of spicing wine didn't die out. It just evolved and became more of a folk tradition than an aristocratic one. The direct descendant of Hypocras is the mulled wine we know today, like German glühwein, Scandinavian glögg, or a traditional English wassail. There are key differences, of course. Modern mulled wine is almost always made with red wine, served hot, and the spices are often left whole and simply simmered in the pot. It's a rustic, comforting drink for cold winter nights. Hypocras was a more refined, carefully filtered product, often served cool, and was a feature of grand summer banquets as much as winter feasts. But the core idea is the same wine, sweetened and infused with the warmth of cinnamon, cloves, and other aromatic spices. Today, there's a renewed interest in historical food and drink. Brewers make medieval-style ales, and chefs recreate old recipes. And Hippocrates is being rediscovered. You can find modern recipes for it online, and some specialty liquor stores even sell bottled versions. It offers a unique taste of the past. Drinking it is a way to connect with the medieval world, a world of global trade in tiny, precious spices, of medicine based on balance, and a feast where every dish and every drink told a story about power and status. The great age of Hypocras is long gone, but the ghost of its sweet, spicy flavor still lingers.